All right, so this lecture is just a sort of intro to religion in general for the course. This is a lot of this information. It's stuff from other textbooks. A little bit of it's from other textbooks, but most of it is from chapter 1 of the textbook for the course, Living Religions, 10th edition. I think I mentioned this in the first video that the very first time I ever taught this class, I taught it from the 7th edition. So there's a few differences, not much in this first lecture, so I won't be saying much about it, but just keep that in mind. So if you are using different editions of the textbook, some of it might change slightly, but more or less, it's all pretty much stay the same, all the information, okay? So let's go ahead and get this slideshow started. And, you know, I'm just going to talk about religion in general. There's a definition of religion in our textbook, which is, you know, fairly helpful. I mean, the word religion is, you know, you could argue a pretty controversial term. Different people might define it different ways. And in fact, you might even take issue with defining some of the traditions that we're going to study this semester as religion, even given this definition, perhaps. We'll see. But I like the definition. It's not horrible. The word religion, you know, originally comes from religio, the sort of the Latin, and it means, you know, like to bind or to hold or something. Something has a hold of you or binds you, or you know, you are stuck to following it or something like this. So that's sort of like the etymology in a sense, right? But here we have, like I said, a pretty general definition, which is pretty workable as far as I'm concerned. According to Mary Pat Fisher, the author, she writes that religion is a particular response to dimensions of life considered sacred as shaped by institutionalized traditions. And we'll talk a little bit later in the lecture about spirituality and, you know, the difference between spirituality and religion. And you'll see the definition she gives for spirituality is quite similar to this, except it lacks this institutionalized part, right? So religions, in some sense, are institutionalized. This word sacred, too, I guess needs to be expanded on a little bit, right? And because we're going to be getting into a lot of metaphysical stuff, we need to talk about what is metaphysics, not in a super deep sense. You know, I'm not like Martin Heidegger here writing, you know, this essay, What is Metaphysics? I just want to give us, for the sake of an intro class, a general view of what these terms mean, right? So again, this is culled from the text, these definitions: the realm of the extraordinary, the ultimately real, beyond everyday perceptions, the supernatural, the holy, not proven or disproven objectively, right? This is maybe just even that first on the list, the realm of the extraordinary. The sacred is seen as something like this. It's not just something normal. It's not just something typical. You know, even if you say, you know, I hold this baseball field sacred, you know, this is where my favorite team played as a kid. It's sacred to me, right? You know, that might not be the sacred that you're thinking of in the context of religion, but even then you might say it's extraordinary. At least it is to me. It's something special that is set aside, right, as sacred. Now, metaphysics, when we talk about metaphysics, we're talking about any philosophy, you know, theory that focuses on the nature of the fundamental nature of reality, you know, often dealing with questions that transcend the physical, hence the term metaphysics. Actually, the term metaphysics really comes from a book by Aristotle that was untitled, and the scholars were reading it and didn't know what to call it, so they called it metaphysics, which literally means after physics, because he wrote it after he wrote his physics. But now we understand by that term having to do with the physical, not, you know, when you take a class in physics, you're studying the physical, but metaphysics is, well, why is there a physical? What is the nature of the physical? Why is there existence at all? These sort of questions are metaphysical questions. So I'm going to explore some other definitions of religion too, right, that aren't quite as expanded upon in your textbook. Some of these figures, though, like Theodor Ludwig is mentioned in the textbook, right? And he's got this four-part definition, right? He says that religion is a human involvement with the sacred. We already talked about what the sacred is in general terms. So it's an involvement with the sacred. It's expressed in thought, action, and social forms. That's the second part, right? So those are always constituents of it. It constitutes a total system of symbols with deep meaning. So it gives you a complete answer, a complete prescription to the big questions in life. And it provides a path for ultimate transformation, right? So it changes you, it transforms you. When you believe the religion, you're a different person, right, than when you don't believe it. So this first part, right, of his definition, it's a human involvement with the sacred, right? How does he, Ludwig, elaborate on this notion of the sacred? Well, he draws a lot from another guy who is also mentioned in the chapter briefly, Rudolf Otto, who talks about this notion of the numinous, okay? The numinous is this pre-rational, pre-moral phenomenon that he thinks is sort of the basis for much of the world's religions, or maybe even all of them. The numinous is this unlimited, primordial force, right? It's mysterious, completely other, and it's overwhelming, right? The Christian, if you're familiar with the early Christian notion of the mysterium tremendum, right? This is also, I don't know if they use the same word, I forgot the term in Jewish theology, this idea that one is scared of God, right? One is fearful of God because it's so overwhelming. It's so, you're in such awe of it, right? That's the third part. There's awe and reverence involved. It's not just mysterious, unsettling, wholly other, but also it does bring a sense of awe and reverence with it, accompanied also with fascination and love, right? So those are all the qualities of the numinous that Otto, sort of lines out, that he thinks, this experience of the numinous is the basis of religious belief, religious faith, right? So religion is always going to involve, it's always going to involve some sense of the sacred, right? Human involvement with the sacred. Again, this is the Theodor Ludwig definition, right? The second part, again, it's expressed in thought, action, and social forms, right? So thought, that's the theoretical part. There's always a dogma, right? What's a dogma? Well, the beliefs, right? As the definition in the book claims, theoretical assertions, systems that are proclaimed to be absolutely true by religious institutions. Now you can use the word dogma in a much more broad sense. You can have a political dogma, for instance. But in this context, obviously, we're studying world religions, and really originally the word dogma was used in a religious context, right? So it's very appropriate, this definition here, right? So a dogma, that's a theoretical aspect of religion. And then also there's things, he says thought and speech, right? These are the forms, these are the forms of expression that are theoretical, right? Like through stories, narratives, and myths. Now, the word myth, I need to pause a little bit here too, to explain. The term myth is often used with negative connotations. It's typically used pejoratively, and we're not going to do that in this class. When we talk about myths, don't get offended when I talk about, well, I probably won't. When we talk about like the Christian religion, I usually use the word parable or story or something like this. But if I say a myth, like the myth of well, I don't know, we're not going to go over Midrash, but if I talk about a myth, I'm not using it in a derogatory sense. It's just a symbolic story, as she puts it, expressing ideas about reality or spiritual history, right? So you might talk about the myth of Genesis, okay? Again, that might offend people to call it a myth. That's what really happened. I'm a Christian. I believe that's the truth. Well, whatever, right? There are some Christians that even Christians, not all Christians think it's a literal truth. Some Christians actually believe that Genesis is symbolic, right? That it wasn't literal. You can look to the writings of St. Augustine. He thinks that Adam is just sort of the symbolic of, original man, and original woman is Eve. But they're just a symbol for our nature, basically. It's a story that sort of tells you teaches you a lesson about our nature, about human nature. That's the Garden of Eden story for Saint Augustine, right? So again, just to clarify, to call something a myth is not necessarily a knock against it. I know some people use that word in that way. That's not how we're going to use it in this course. Okay, so I think I said way too much than I needed to about theoretical, right? So again, all religions have thought, actions, and social forms that are included in them. They're expressed through these. Theoretical ones we've covered enough, I think. Practical, so through practices, doing and acting. And then, the things that really come to mind more than anything would be like rituals and ethics. Ritual, again, is another word, I think, that gets negative connotations, especially because we live in the West and it's dominated religiously by Christianity. At least it has historically been. And so typically the word ritual is used in a very negative sense, right? Satanic rituals, right? That's sort of the connotation that it brings up. Christians don't talk about rituals; they talk about sacraments and worship and things like that, right? But those are forms of ritual in the sense that we're using it here, right? We're just talking about repeated pattern religious acts. So going to church every Sunday is a ritual, right? It's a habit that you form. I don't even want to call it a habit. That might be too derogatory, but anyway, it's something that you do as a part of your faith that's repetitive, that's patterned. That's a ritual, okay? So again, not intending to have negative connotations with that word either. Ethics, I'm not going to explain that. I'm hoping that you guys already know what the word means. If it doesn't, look it up, right? Right and wrong, how to act, all that sort of thing. And then, of course, last but not least, we have the social forms, right? Religion always involves some sort of social forms, fellowships, communities, leaders, followers, etc., right? And then, so don't forget, right, this is a 4-part definition. It's a human involvement with the sacred, expressed in thought, action, and social forms. And it constitutes a total system of symbols with deep meaning, right? So it's presented, at least. You might find flaws in some of these religions. We all probably could. And of course, maybe the flaws that you see is just because this is such a short course and we can't cover every religion in depth, right? We have to just sort of give you a general picture of it. But they're at least presented as total systems, that they have answers for all the questions that you need, when it comes to guiding yourself through life and knowing what's the state of the universe, right? I don't know if that's really true of all religions, especially if you consider some of the ones we're covering, like Taoism, at least the earlier forms of that. But this is something that is definitely a typical feature of many of them, right? And last but not least, it provides a path for ultimate transformation, right? It makes you a different person, right? Okay, so now we get to spirituality, right? And unfortunately, I don't have any participants in this lecture. I'm doing all this stuff for extra credit for my students so that we can have these videos for future generations. And unfortunately, nobody is here to participate in this lecture, right? And I usually have a little class conversation to talk about, is it possible to be religious but not be spiritual? And what does that mean, right? Well, I personally like the author's definition of spirituality. I have my issues with this textbook. I definitely don't think it's a perfect textbook. There's a lot that's wrong with it, actually, I think. I especially don't like some of the way that they Latinize some of the religious terms, like from the Sanskrit, especially to English. I think they don't really do it well, and they make students learn to pronounce words. Like if you're just trying to guess how to pronounce a term, like you're going to totally say it wrong. But anyways, right, enough of that. I digress. I do like what she says about spirituality, because I think this is kind of like, you hear people say this a lot. I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious. I sometimes would say that too myself. I do consider myself somewhat spiritual, at least in this sense, right? If the word sacred is understood in that broad, more general sense I was referring to earlier, then maybe I might even be spiritual in this sense. There are things I hold sacred that I do value in that sense, and I think they're just extraordinary and just not, maybe not metaphysically or spiritually, like, there's magic, right? So maybe the word spirituality isn't the right word, but don't know what else to call it. But she says that spirituality is a personal response to dimensions of life considered sacred. So how is that any different from her definition of religion? Remember, religion is a particular response to dimensions of life considered sacred, as shaped by institutionalized tradition. So she changes the word from particular to personal, right? So instead of just some particular, like some individual particular person, no, it's a very personal, unique individual, my response, or yours, right, if you're the spiritual person, to dimensions that are considered sacred, right? And so it's not institutionalized per se. It doesn't have to be a part of a church or an organization, but it's more of a deep sort of introspective approach, I suppose, to the sacred, as she's putting it here, right? And I asked the question, can you be spiritual and not religious, or religious and not spiritual? Again, this is a good conversation piece, but since I'm just lecturing, I guess I can move on. I will say, though, that I remember I just have an anecdote. I was at a bookstore once, and I saw there was the stand in the middle of the store, the kiosk, whatever you call it, it has like a big stack of books that are on sale, kind of show them off and market them to everybody. There was a book that said, what is it, Religion Without Spirituality, or something like this, or I forget exactly how it was phrased, the title, but it was something like that. And this father and son were like staring at it and just like shaking their heads. Spirituality without religion, what are you can't get spiritual without the Lord Jesus Christ, and you need religion, so like, I don't know. I think that if you understand the terms in this way, that those guys were being foolish. Sorry guys, but I get it. I understand what they're saying. Like if you believe that your faith is the only right one, then obviously you're going to think anybody who doesn't believe it must be a moron. You're going to roll your eyes at them, but that's very condescending and disrespectful. I hope you know that. I know, some people think it makes them like better people, or like smarter somehow, but I hope maybe you are smarter. If you're right, I guess, the other people are going to be damned to whatever, but it doesn't look good, that for sure. Did Jesus smirk at the people that didn't believe in him? Think about it that way, I guess. I don't think so. I think, he seemed like a pretty chill dude. Let's see here. Sorry to call him a dude, for those of you, the Lord and Savior. He was, a lot of respect for those teachings, but I'm an outsider, right? So can I even really understand Christianity? This is like sort of the next question that I don't really want to spend much time on, because this is more like a conversation piece. I use this in class normally to sort of get some class discussion, but it's an interesting question to think about. I think we all have our biases, myself included. I'm not going to approach all these religions objectively. I'm going to try to as best as I can. I'm a teacher here, right? So I want to just sort of present information, but I have to sort of be honest with myself. I find a lot of these, some of these traditions more fascinating than others. I find some of them more compelling than others. I'm going to try to keep a poker face, but I know it's going to be hard for me. I'm a pretty passionate guy. So who is it that can really understand religion, right? We all have our biases, but are some of us in a better position to understand and study religion than others? This is a controversial question, right? So maybe there's different types, but I have these three sort of types that I've listed of the type of people who might study religion. There's the insider, the reporter, and the specialist. Okay, so the insider, what I mean by that is, somebody who is an actual believer, right? So if you're studying Buddhism, you're actually a Buddhist, right? So you're a practitioner. You go to the temple and you do meditations, all that, and you study it as a scholar, right? So you're aware of being a Buddhist. You know what it's like to be a Buddhist. You have that belief system, and you live it, and you study it, right? So that's the insider. Then the reporter would be somebody who is just completely objective, who's not in the religion at all, who's just going there and observing it, right, as an outsider, and just writing down facts about the religion, right, about the way it's practiced, about what the people say about it, et cetera, et cetera. The specialist, last but not least, this is somebody who, whether or not they're an insider or a reporter, they pick one religion and devote their entire life to studying that one religion. So they're a specialist. And some would argue that you have to be a specialist to understand some of these religions, particularly things like Hinduism, Christianity, Judaism, Islam. They're going to argue that these systems are so complex. There's so much to them, and they have such a rich history, cultural history, philosophical history, history of thought, all of this, intellectual history. All of this stuff needs to be taken into consideration to get a full appreciation and understanding of that tradition. So if you really want to understand Hindu, you've got to devote your whole life to Hinduism. If you really want to understand Buddhism, you have to devote your whole life as a scholar specialist, right? So who's in a better position to understand these religions? You know, I feel like they've all got their own biases. You might think, well, geez, that specialist guy sounds like he knows what he's talking about. You know, if he's a specialist in Buddhism, he might not know anything about Christianity, so I'm not going to ask him how to interpret a certain vague passage in the Bible. But he'll know about his surahs and all that, right? The Buddhist discourses, right? And so if there's a particularly difficult Buddhist discourse, I'll go to that specialist. He'll have a really good explanation for me, right? But then you got to think about it this way too. That might be their little baby, right? Like because they devote their whole life to Judaism or Buddhism or whatever, they might have a bias, even if they aren't like super committed to the belief system, right? They might be kind of secular and they just are fascinated by it. There are people like that, right, who spend their whole life studying Christianity and they're not Christians. I've met them. They exist. You might no, what? No, they do. They think it's they respect the tradition. They think it's an important tradition. They think it's fascinating. And so, but even still, I think they might, because it's their baby, even if they're not a practitioner, they might have their bias, right? They might think that, oh, well, the Christian approach to this problem is better than the Muslim approach or Jewish approach or Buddhist approach or whatever. And it's like, well, do you believe that because you got a really good argument and like they do have a better way of explaining that certain thing that's less problematic? Or is it just because you studied it longer and you're more comfortable with that argument and it makes more sense to you because you've seen it longer, right? That familiarity, sometimes it breeds contempt, but sometimes familiarity breeds love and affection, right? But back to these first two, the insider, the reporter, you know, some would say you can't understand a religion if you don't believe it, right? A lot of people that proselytize, you know, my whole life I've heard that you've got to believe, then you'll know, right? It's like you can't understand. And to me, I mean, as annoying as that is, I would say that there's something to that. There really is, right? I mean, if you really want to know what it's like to be a Christian, you've got to be a Christian. You know, to me, though, the problem is you can't just decide to be a Christian. You might know, if you've ever studied any other philosophy, you might be familiar with Pascal's wager, right? Blaise Pascal was a French, I think bishop was the highest title he got, and I could be wrong about that, but he was fairly high up in the church, and he wrote a lot of philosophy. And he made a wager, right? He said, you know, you might as well believe in God because, you know, even if you're wrong, at least you get to heaven, right? So it's sort of this wager, right? But if you don't believe and he does exist, then you're gonna be punished. So, you know, just what the heck, you know, might as well believe just for the heck of it, right? And the problem with that is, do you really just, if, like, let's say you don't believe in something, can you just decide to believe in it? I don't think it works that easy, right? And even some of his contemporaries who were his friends were like, that doesn't work. God knows you're not really sincere. Of course, he thought that it was a trick, right? It was to trick people into coming to church. And then after they actually tried to be a Christian, they would realize it was the right choice, and they would truly believe. But again, I'm digressing again, talking about Pascal. But the idea is that the insider, the person that actually has faith, is in a way better position to really understand that faith, and no one else could really understand it that way. So I think, again, like I said, there's something to that, right? The reporter is, like we said, the outsider who's just there to report. And you might say again, hey, they're the best one. They're the ones that can study religion because they don't have a bias. The specialist might prefer what they specialize in. The insider's obviously going to prefer the religion they believe in. I mean, obviously, if you're Buddhist, you're going to think Buddhism is the best. If you're Christian, you're going to think Christianity is the best. So they're both going to be biased, where people can say, well, the reporter's in the middle, he's like not biased, right? But who knows? Maybe he's got cultural biases, even if he's completely secular, of a secular mindset. So I don't know. It's interesting to think about, interesting to ponder. They've all got their pros and cons, I suppose, right? So, you know, what makes it so hard to study religions, I guess, too, is that they're not static, right? They're always evolving. It's sort of you're studying a moving target, I guess you could say. And they're not easy to observe apart from your own cultural filter, right? So even if you are this reporter who's just an outsider looking in, you've got your own cultural biases that you might not even be aware of yourself, right? But let's hope that it's not impossible. Let's hope that studying world religions is not impossible. Now, we're going to get into some of these theories about religion from the textbook, okay? So these are just some of the few. There's way more than this. But the first one they mention is scientific materialism, right? So when people are asking, like, where do religions come from? Okay, so we kind of talked enough about what they are, but why do we have them? Why do we make them, right? Well, one answer is from the scientific materialists. They're going to say that the supernatural is just imagined by humans. Really only the natural world is what exists, right? Everything else is just something we made up, right? So they're just stories we tell, right? But why do we make up these stories, right? Well, there's different types of scientific materialists, right? There's the people like Feuerbach, right, pictured here. And Ludwig Feuerbach, an atheist guy, but he actually thought Christianity was a good thing in a certain sense. And because he thought that, well, they provides order, right? So in a sense, they don't give him credit for this in the book, but in a sense, he was a bit of a functionalist. We'll get to functionalism in a minute, right? But they're just calling him in general. He's a scientific materialist. He thought that the deities that we worship, gods or goddesses, or just God as a monotheistic notion, they're just objectifications of human qualities, right? We think of things like power, wisdom, love, and we project it onto this imagined cosmic deity, right? When we worship this deity as supreme, we don't recognize that those qualities are in ourselves. In fact, quite the opposite is true, right? We actually start to disdain ourselves. You can think of the notion of original sin in Christianity. And this is also maybe an example of cultural bias. Feuerbach was focusing on Christianity in his studies when he was trying to just report on it and talk about what it is as a human phenomenon, and he says, oh, it makes us think that God is great and we're crap, and I don't know, does all religion do that, or is that something that comes from him just looking and focusing on one particular religion, right? And the notion of, or maybe even just one aspect of that religion, right? This idea of original sin. Now, Freud is somebody I'm sure you're familiar with. You might not know a whole lot about him, but I'm sure you've heard his name. Sigmund Freud, the psychoanalyst. He thought that religion is a collective fantasy, right? As he puts it, a universal obsessional neurosis. Pretty controversial statements there, right? He says it's a reenactment of our loving and fearful relationship with our parents, right? So God is sort of this father figure, right, that protects us from all the terrors of life and nature that we can't control. He rewards and punishes us for obeying or disobeying social norms, right? So for Freud, religion is a way of keeping our id, right, that naughty part of our ego, or sorry, that of our psyche, that really naughty the hungry, horny part of us at bay and in control, that violent part of us. Religion helps do that, right? But it's an illusion, as he says. It's an illusion springing from insecurity and neurotic guilt, and in that sense, it resembles mental illness, right? Again, very controversial statements by Freud, but again, he wrote this essay, The Future of an Illusion, one of his last essays, and I recommend it. It's a pretty good read, right? Another one he wrote, Civilization and Its Discontents, also touches a bit on this, and I think it's even a better essay. But we've said enough. I think you get the picture, right? Karl Marx, right? Another scientific materialist, right? More known for his political philosophy, but you also always hear this quote that Marx thought that religion was the opiate of the masses, right? It's created to manipulate and control people. And historically, he says, it's always been supported it's supported by or connived with secular powers, right? The king, the ruler, the churches, they're always sort of, kind of in bed with the monarchy and or whoever the ruling class may be. And it's just kind of like Freud said, a way to organize society. So he thinks that any culture's religion is always going to develop out of its economic framework. And he thought that not just about religion, but Marx, he was very materialistic about a lot of things in this sense. And materialism, meaning that everything can be explained in terms of matter, right? You might be confused with the word materialism. Often you're thinking like bling bling and bougie and all that stuff, but no, what we're talking about here is a sort of metaphysics, right? That the world is just matter. It's just made of matter. And so for Marx, all this religion and even political ideology, economic theory and things like this, most of it develops from the way that the country is organized economically, how things are produced, who's in power and who controls the means of production. They're the ones that develop theories, and the theories are basically, they arise from the economic framework, and they're there to keep it in power, basically, to keep it sustained, right? To sustain the current economic system. So, religion is a sort of opiate of the masses, as he puts it, right? Opiate of the people. It gives them this false sense of hope. Even though I'm this factory worker working my ass off every day and getting very little paid for it, and I'm getting into debt, and I can't barely feed myself or put a roof over my head, it's okay, because if I'm a good Christian, I'll go to heaven or something, right? So that's the idea, is that it gives us a dignity, a sense of dignity, even though we live these miserable lives. So Marx, he thought that, I think he's often misunderstood. He was almost sort of like, thank goodness we have religion, right? It gives these people something so they can't, to be able to live with their horrible situation. But he also thought that eventually we should move on to a society, it'd be ideal to move on to a society where it wasn't necessary to have this, right? This false pacification through religion. Okay, so moving on, we enough about scientific materialism. They also in the book mention a sociological theory, functionalism, right? And the idea here is that religions exist because they're useful, right? They serve a function, not just for each of us as individuals, making our lives better, but for society as a whole, right? So Emil Durkheim is the first, again, he's a sociologist. Most of these theorists are sociologists or philosophers or psychoanalysts. But Durkheim, he's considered by many the father of modern sociology. He thought that humans can't survive, or they can't live without some sort of organized social structure, and religion is sort of this glue that kind of holds society together, right? Jean Bowker's a more recent functionalist. He's a biologist. He wrote a book called Is God a Virus? And so he takes this sort of like biologist approach, this evolutionary approach. He thinks that religions are organized systems that serve a biological purpose. So they bring us together for survival. They protect gene replication and all this. And so because religion has survival value, the potential for religiosity, he thinks, is genetically inherent, or at least it may be genetically inherent in the human brain. But I think, and the author of the book here mentions there's problems with this when you think about religious practices like celibacy and martyrdom, or self-sacrifice. Those don't seem like the best traits for survival, right? So, and there's like, a lot of religions that are completely celibate, don't have kids, don't have sex. How are you going to spread your genes if that's the case, right? So it's not a perfect theory, right? But again, he thinks that we're biologically wired to believe religion because it actually serves a purpose, right? You can also derive some functionalist explanations from the medical field, right? There's a lot of studies that say religion is good for your health, right? People that are religious tend to lead longer lives. They're less depressed, lower blood pressure, less likely to smoke. There people have done studies on the power of prayer, and they're pretty inconclusive, honestly, if you're gonna be honest about it. But there are definitely studies that if you pray, it's good for yourself, right? Whether or not it actually helps the world, that's something that's more, more difficult to pin down. But if you meditate or you pray every day, this is typically shown to relieve mental stress. Okay, another functionalist that's mentioned in the textbook is a guy named Erich Fromm. He's a psychoanalyst also, just like Freud. And, not much new here. Just like Durkheim, he thought that humans need a stable frame of reference, and religions help to fulfill this. Last but not least, we've got sort of the more common view, right? The less academic view is the belief perspective, right? Why do we have religions? Well, because they're right, or at least one of them is right. There truly is this underlying reality that can't be readily perceived, right? And when we respond to this supreme reality and we express it in some institutionalized form as some structured system, that's what we call religion. So you get friends of this view, from the philosophy world. Not a lot, but a few people like William James. He was a psychologist, philosopher. He wrote a book called The Varieties of Religious Experience, and he was pretty, I would say, sympathetic to religious belief. I'm not sure to say that he was he had a belief perspective. I think it might be a bit misleading. But he thought that religious beliefs were somehow valid, right? There are rational modes of thought and non-rational modes of knowing. You still know, but even though it's non-rational, and there are two valid ways of apprehending reality, right? This is often seen by many people as mysticism, okay? And mysticism is often used with negative connotations, right? Typically by philosophers. That's just mysticism, right? You can't prove that. But what does it mean, right? Some religions think that mysticism is, or some religious people believe that mysticism is a necessary element to religious experience. But what is it? It's the idea that we can perceive truth directly beyond the senses, beyond the limits of human reason, beyond blind belief, just based on direct experience, right? A direct experience of the divine or the sacred, right? So there's mystical experiences where religious practitioners are able to actually directly experience the divine, the sacred, to experience God, to become one with that divine force. Another path that's mentioned is to belief is through deep questioning, right? Martin Luther King Jr. is mentioned in your textbook as someone who spent their life in deep questioning as a path towards his own personal faith, right? There are different ways that this experience, right, if you're some mystic or even if you're not a mystic, right, you might use different words, and we're going to see these throughout the semester. Many of these we'll expand on as we explore these different traditions. But the experience of the divine has been referred to as enlightenment, realization, illumination, kinsho, right? That's a Zen term from Zen Buddhism. Awakening, self-knowledge, gnosis, ecstatic communion, and even coming home, right? You're coming home. You're back to the place where you always were and always needed to be, right? Now, sometimes these experiences happen spontaneously. You know, for example, people speak of near-death experiences, but mostly, you know, we're talking about mystics especially, these are going to be induced, right? You're going to meditate, fast, pray, chant, drugs even sometimes, dancing around into a frenzy to achieve this state, right? This divine state. And some say that these experiences will transcend what are called dualistic conceptions of reality, right? We normally see ourselves as separate from the world around us. You know, I'm myself, I'm separate from my environment. You know, I'm not this desk that I'm sitting at. I'm not this chair that I'm sitting in. I'm not this cell phone that I'm looking at to check the time. I'm Travis. I'm this teacher. You know, I'm professor giving you a lecture on religion. But when we experience the divine this way, that whole dichotomy, that whole dualistic conception is dissolved. We become one with the universe, right? We'll talk about this experience a lot more as the semester progresses, because it is important, an important experience for several traditions, and they understand it differently. So we'll have to elaborate on that. Rudolf Otto, he was mentioned earlier when we were talking about you know, that Theodor Ludwig's definition of religion. You know, Otto did a lot of work on what was called the numinous and exploring that. He was a German professor of theology. He thought that this experience of the numinous, right, this direct experience of the divine, that's why we have religions, right? They come from this, right? People have this experience of oneness with the universe, this experience that's ineffable, right? You can't explain it or put it into words. You know, it's irreducible to anything else. This experience is what makes religion exist, right? It brings us this feeling of awe or dread, right? Remember the mysterium tremendum that I spoke of earlier, right? One last figure that I think, is this the last one, or we got a couple more, right? Sorry, okay. So 2 more to go. Walking Walk, right? He also is very sympathetic to the belief perspective, right? He thinks that all these experiences, whether you're looking at a Buddhist experience or a Christian or whatever, they all follow a certain pattern. There's always these elements involved. It always involves the experience of an unseen reality, right? Something beyond what's just given. It involves our whole being, right? We're immersed in it completely. And it is the most shattering and intense of human experiences, right? That's why we have to base these life-changing, life-altering philosophies, systems of thought around these experiences. They motivate action, right? Through worship, ethical behavior, service, sharing with others within that group. one last figure I want to mention, that he's not a functionalist or a scientific materialist. He doesn't. I'm not really, honestly, not even sure what he believed as far as the belief perspective. I have a feeling that he was a little mystic. Messiah Eliad. Again, I don't know a lot about the guy, so I hesitate to say too much here. But he's known as sort of the father of comparative religion. So he's an important person to mention. If it weren't for him, we might not even be taking this class, right? We might not even be teaching it. He helped to establish the comparative studies of religion as an academic discipline. So just some terminology here. I don't know if I want to go over it, because I usually go over it in class and I have students sort of tell me the definition and what they think the words mean. I'm not going to do that, right? Because no one's here and there's no interaction. So you guys have the textbook. The only thing I'll say is here, I've got phenomenology with an asterisk on it, okay? This is a book that they cut. It's not in the 10th edition. It's in the 7th edition and the 8th edition, but I don't think it's in the 9th or the 10th. So phenomenology is a word that it's a very technical word in philosophy. I'm not going to give you this broad technical definition. That's probably going to confuse you. But just really briefly, phenomenology, you're trying to understand or study something from the perspective of the person experiencing it. That's the most simple way I can put it. I know that's not very simple, but let me repeat. So you're trying to study something and understand it, some sort of phenomenon, from the standpoint of the person who's experiencing it. So in other words, in the context of this class, when you're trying to study a Buddhist or you're trying to study a Shinto or anything like that, try to understand what it would be like for somebody who believes that system, right? And maybe that'll give you a fuller appreciation of it. I know that's hard to do sometimes because you're so used to perhaps your own belief systems and your own assumptions that when you come to, encounter other beliefs that are so far removed from that, you might be like, whoa, that's odd, that's weird, why do they believe that? Right? But try to think about, well, why might somebody believe that? If I was living at that time period in that area of the world, given that political climate and that social climate, how might I experience things? And let me just assume I did believe that. How might that shape my perspective on other things? Okay, so I think it's a helpful word. I'm kind of glad they scratched it from the book because I forgot the definition they gave, but it was a really bad definition, right? It wasn't that bad the way I make it sound, but it wasn't good. It wasn't very good. It wasn't really accurate to what the word really meant. So, but I'm glad they mentioned it because I want us to approach this course kind of like that, right? Try to be open-minded, even if it's something you don't believe. Think about what it would be like if you did believe it and how it would shape your ethics, your outlook, how you would judge things right and wrong, and things like that. It's an interesting way to approach it. Okay, more terminology. Again, not gonna spend much time on this. Maybe here's what I'll do. I'll list all these words, right? The profane, the sacred, immanent, transcendent, theistic, monotheistic, polytheistic, non-theistic, incarnations, right? Like Jesus was an incarnation, exclusivist, universalist, atheist, agnostic, phenomenology, I explained, rituals, we talked about earlier, symbols, right? Religious symbols. I have Carl Jung here in parentheses. You may be familiar with Jung. He thought that religious symbols were somewhat universal, that you find symbols throughout all religions that are similar enough, they're close, and for him that was evidence that there's a universal subconscious, and these universal archetypes, these universal I don't know, I hate to use the word stereotype because that's kind of derogative, but just concepts that all humans shared, right? And that they were going to be uniform across religions, right? Interesting character, Jung, right? Okay, now we got this debate here between creationism and Darwinism. I don't have a lot of time. I got like 10 minutes left before my class starts. My office hours are almost over. So I've got to kind of rush through this. Let me see. Okay, I've only got 3 slides left, so we're not doing too bad. I'm going to unfortunately have to rush through these last 3 slides, right? But creationism is the view that there was an intentional divine creation of all life forms. So every life form you see now was created with a plan in place, whereas Darwinism is the idea that no, the universe evolved through processes, right? Genetic mutations, natural selection, random combination of elements. right? So these are often seen as competing views, right? And depending on how hardcore of a creationist you are and what you mean by creationism, they certainly are competing views, right? But there are some who think that there are other ways of approaching this dichotomy between science and religion, right? And again, I'm in a big rush, so I'm not going to spend too much time on these. You can read more about them in the textbook. But these are the four models that are brought forth at the end of chapter 1 of sort of the relationship between science and religion. Are they antagonistic? Do they have to be antagonistic? That's the conflict model, right? Yes, they're conflicting. They both make claims that can't both be true. One has to be true and the other has to be false. So they have to basically butt heads, right? Other people might argue that no, there's this separate realms model, that no, religion deals with the non-physical, science deals with the physical, right? That's one example of a separate realms model. And then you've got like the dialogue model, right? That they're asking the same questions, but they're maybe coming at it from different angles, and so they can actually help each other, and there's a sort of dialogue between them. Not a lot of people, I think, share this view now. That's not a typical model that you're going to see people follow. I'm sure there's people out there that are like that, but they're pretty unique. The integration model used to be what everybody did, right? Before the scientific revolution, religion and science were seen as the same thing, right? They were integrated together, that doing one was doing the other, right? That, again, is something that is very historically almost non-existent anymore, but previously was the main thing until people like Copernicus and Galileo and etc. Right? So I hate to be rushing through this because it's a very interesting topic and there's a lot more I could say about this. But again, I've got students that are waiting probably, and I've got to get started in 9 minutes, 8 minutes now. So I got one more slide left, and we're going to talk more about this later as we cover the actual religions. But, we can't shy away from the negative aspects, okay? Each of these traditions have some bad things in their history, right? So what are some possible negative aspects of religion? Charismatic leaders, right? Like Reverend Jim Jones. If you don't know who he is, look him up. He's a pretty scary character, right? I wish I had time to explain him because he's fascinating, but very, very disturbing. Sometimes when you're religious, it can exaggerate guilt. You feel guilty about everything you're doing, and it can lead to sort of psychological problems. Some might argue that religion can open the door for escapism, right? Instead of actually dealing with your real life problems, you escape to church and just hide from them or go confess. Instead of actually dealing with bad things you've done to people, you just go confess your sins and you feel good about it, right? And that's a way of sort of escaping your problems and not dealing with them head on, right? So that's one criticism. Also, historically, many religions, most of them that have been dominant, have been also politically oppressive, right? Sometimes they want to eradicate all other belief systems violently. Sometimes they're oppressive towards women, right? They tend to be patriarchal. And so these are all some negative aspects of religion. And again, as controversial as they can be, I don't want to shy away from this stuff. This is not a class in the clean version, the good fuddy-duddy version. Religion's all good and everything's wonderful about it. No, we're going to try to look at as much as we can and be as objective as we can, with all those caveats we mentioned earlier about being objective. But I really, again, I'm sorry I had to rush through those last few slides. Probably a lot more I could have said about those, but alas, I am really short on time, and I better start my my next class Zoom meeting because it's it takes a while sometimes to load up. Thanks for sticking around to the end of the video. We're finally going to get started on actual religious tradition. Next, I've got Hinduism coming up. That's the first one we're going to look at. It's the oldest one that we really are going to be dealing with. Goes back, the writings go back further than any other tradition that we're going to cover this semester, so why not start there? So I'm excited. I haven't taught this class in forever. I sure hope that I get more participants though in the Hinduism stuff, but that should be up by the end of the week, at least part 1 and 2. There should be 3 or 4 parts to Hinduism. We'll see how long it takes me to get through all the stuff I want to cover. But again, thanks for sticking around to the end of the video, and I hope you got a lot out of it. Cheers.